The morning Bernard Chandler rode into Laredo, Texas, he had 43 cents in his coat pocket, a horse with a loose shoe, and absolutely no intention of falling in love with anyone. It was the spring of 1873, and the frontier town of Laredo sat along the Rio Grande like a man who had fallen asleep in the sun and forgotten to wake up. Dust coated everything, the storefronts, the horses tied at their hitching posts, the faces of the men who loitered on the boardwalks with nothing better to do than watch strangers ride in. Bernard was used to being watched. He was the kind of man who drew eyes without wanting to. Tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone that built the canyon walls west of the Pecos River. He wore his brown hair a little long, curling at the collar of his shirt, and his eyes were the color of creek water in late afternoon, not quite green, not quite gray, but something in between that shifted depending on the light. He was 28 years old and had been making his living as a hired escort and trail guide for the better part of 5 years. He knew the land between the Rio Grande and the Red River better than most men knew their own parlors. He had guided cattle drives, escorted supply wagons, led a circuit preacher through Comanche territory twice without losing a single soul, and had once tracked a stolen mule for 3 days through the hill country on behalf of a banker who paid him in silver and a hot meal. It was not a glamorous life, but it was honest, and the open sky had always suited him better than 4 walls. He pulled his roan mare, a patient animal he called Cressida, to a stop in front of the telegraph office and stepped down onto the street, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. He had received a wire 3 days ago at a way station near Eagle Pass, sent by a man named Thomas Whitfield, who identified himself as an attorney representing the estate of one Harold Barrett of San Antonio. The wire was brief and professional, stating that Mr. Whitfield required the services of a skilled trail guide to escort one Miss Sallie Barrett north from Laredo to the town of Abilene, Kansas, a journey of roughly 700 miles, and that the rate of pay would be $30 up front and $40 upon safe arrival. $70 was more money than Bernard had seen in one lump since the previous autumn, and he had ridden hard to get here. He found Thomas Whitfield in the back room of a small law office that smelled of ink and old paper, a narrow man in his 50s with wire spectacles and the permanently worried expression of someone who handled other people's problems for a living. Whitfield shook Bernard's hand and looked him over with the careful assessment of a man buying a horse. "You come recommended by John Totham," Whitfield said, settling back in his chair. "He says you know the Kishom Trail well." "I have ridden sections of it 6 times, Bernard said. "I know the water sources, the trouble spots, the places where the ground goes soft in spring. I know which crossings are safe after rain and which ones will swallow a wagon whole." Whitfield nodded, pressing his fingertips together. "The assignment is simple in theory. Miss Barrett is Harold Barrett's daughter. Harold passed away 2 months ago, leaving her the family property in Abilene, a house and a modest piece of farmland that her father acquired before he relocated south on account of his health. Miss Barrett has lived in San Antonio her whole life, but has no remaining family there. The property in Abilene represents her only means of support. She needs to get there before the end of June, when the deed transfer becomes legally complicated." Bernard pulled out the small notebook he always carried and jotted down what Whitfield told him about the route, the approximate dates, the towns where they might resupply, the nature of the terrain. He was methodical about his work. It was what kept him and the people he guided alive. "How old is Miss Barrett?" he asked, not looking up from his notebook. 24, Whitfield said. "Has she traveled before? Long distances, difficult roads?" Whitfield hesitated, which was answer enough. "She is not without spirit," he said carefully. "But no, she has not undertaken anything of this nature. I would ask that you treat her with the full respect due a lady of her position." "I treat everyone I guide with respect," Bernard said evenly. "It is not a special accommodation." He received the $30 up front in a sealed envelope, shook Whitfield's hand again, and was told that Miss Barrett would be ready to depart the following morning at dawn. He spent the rest of that day seeing to Cressida's shoe at the local blacksmith, purchasing trail supplies, dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork, coffee, hardtack, a new length of rope, and sleeping in a real bed at the town's single boarding house for the first time in 2 weeks. He fell asleep thinking about the route north and nothing else. Sallie Barrett was standing on the front porch of the boarding house at dawn with her chin lifted and her hands folded in front of her, and she looked like a woman who had made up her mind about something and was waiting for the world to catch up with her. She was not what Bernard had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was slender and straight-backed, with dark brown hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed traveling hat that had clearly seen better days. Her dress was practical dark blue wool, not the kind of finery a woman wore when she was trying to impress someone, and she had a single trunk, a canvas travel bag, and a determined expression that suggested she had been crying recently but had decided to stop. Her eyes, when they found his across the yard, were a deep warm brown, steady and direct in a way that caught him off guard. "Mr. Chandler," she said, coming down the steps with her hand extended. "I am Sallie Barrett." "Mr. Whitfield has told me you are reliable." Bernard took her hand and shook it briefly. "I try to be." "Good," she said, and that was that. He had arranged a second horse for her, a steady-tempered bay gelding he had hired from the local livery for the duration of the journey, along with a small pack mule to carry the trunk and supplies. Sallie approached the bay without hesitation, checked the girth herself with practiced hands, and mounted without needing assistance, swinging up into the saddle with an ease that told him she had ridden before, at least around a ranch or property if not on open trail. He revised his estimation of her slightly upward. They left Laredo as the sun was breaking over the hills to the east, painting the sky in thin, watercolor strips of gold and rose. The town fell behind them slowly, the sound of it fading until there was only the wind and the rhythmic percussion of hooves on dry earth. Bernard set a moderate pace, not too hard to start. The horses needed to find their rhythm, and so did the person riding beside him. For the first hour, Sallie Barrett did not say a word. Neither did Bernard. He watched the land the way he always did on the first day out, reading it like a long and familiar text. The quality of the soil, the direction of the wind, the distant smudge of cloud that might or might not become weather by afternoon. He marked landmarks in his mind, the way he always did, building the day's map. When she finally spoke, it surprised him a little, not the fact of it but what she said. "My father was a difficult man to love," she said, looking straight ahead at the horizon. "But I did love him, I want you to know that. In case I seem," she paused, searching for the word, "in case I seem unmoved, I am not unmoved. I simply do not have the luxury of falling apart on horseback." Bernard looked at her sideways. "No," he agreed. "Falling apart on horseback is generally inadvisable." There was a beat, and then she laughed, a short, surprised sound that she seemed to catch herself doing. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone louder," she said. The men Mr. Whitfield described were all considerably louder. He almost smiled at that. "I save my loudness for emergencies." "Good," she said again, in that same final way she had used on the porch, and they rode on. The first day covered roughly 25 miles, which was reasonable for an easy start. The land north of Laredo was scrubby and dry, mesquite and prickly pear, and the occasional live oak throwing its hunched shadow over pale rock. Bernard found them a campsite near a shallow bend in a seasonal creek where there was still water running, hobbled the horses, set a fire, and began preparing a simple supper of salt pork and beans while Sallie unpacked what she needed from the canvas bag. She was neat and efficient about setting up her sleeping area, folding her blanket with care, positioning her bag as a pillow. She did not complain about the ground or the lack of a bed or the smoke from the fire that shifted direction every few minutes. She sat across the flames from him, ate what he gave her without commentary, and watched the darkness settle over the hills with an expression that was impossible to read. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked when the supper things were cleared away and the fire had settled to a comfortable low burn. "Guiding people, about 5 years. And before that, he was quiet for a moment because the honest answer was complicated and the simple answer left too much out. "I ranched," he said, "for my family for a time, then for other people." "Why did you stop?" He looked at the fire. "My family's place was taken, land dispute." The kind that was not really a dispute so much as a decision that had already been made by people with more money and more lawyers than us. She was quiet, and he could feel her listening in the way some people listen, with real attention, not just waiting for their turn to speak. "I am sorry," she said. "That is unjust." "It is common," he said. "That does not make it less unjust, but it is common." She nodded slowly. "My father lost a property in that same manner years ago. He never spoke of it directly, but I could tell it marked him, made him grip what he had all the tighter." She paused. "Which is perhaps why he bought land in Kansas and held onto it even after he came south. He wanted to know it was there, something that could not easily be taken." Bernard thought about that. "And now it comes to you." "And now it comes to me," she agreed softly. They did not talk much more that night. When the fire burned low, Sallie said a quiet good night and lay down on her bedroll, pulling her blanket around her. Bernard sat up a little longer, as he always did, listening to the night sounds and making sure the horses were settled. Cressida nickered softly from the dark, and he murmured back to her, and the stars turned slowly overhead, enormous and indifferent, the way the sky always was out here in the open country. He fell asleep thinking about the land dispute he had mentioned, which he did not usually talk about, and wondering why he had told her. The second day brought wind from the northwest, cool and persistent, and the land began to change as they moved up through the brush country toward San Antonio. The scrub thickened and then thinned again, replaced gradually by cedar and post oak on the rolling hills, the soil shifting from pale limestone dust to something darker and richer. They passed through small settlements, a handful of houses, a well, a church with a hand-painted sign, and once they skirted wide around a homestead where a dog barked itself hoarse from behind a fence. Sallie had grown more comfortable in the saddle by now, the initial stiffness of the first day working itself out. She rode well, sitting quiet and balanced, and she had a good instinct for following Bernard's pace without being told. When he slowed, she slowed. When he took a different line around a rocky patch, she followed without question. She watched the land the way he did, he noticed, with alert, curious eyes that moved and tracked and recorded. "You have been watching the cattle sign," he said at one point when she craned to look at a distant herd moving along a ridge. "I find it interesting," she said. "The way they move. The way they follow each other, and yet somehow the whole herd turns as a single thing." "They read each other," Bernard said. "Small signals. Direction of the head, the set of the ears. One nervous animal can unsettle 1,000. People are like that too," she said. "In crowded places, I have noticed it. One frightened face in a room and suddenly everyone is looking around for the danger." He glanced at her. "You observe people carefully." "I taught school," she said, "for 3 years back in San Antonio. When you are trying to hold the attention of 20 children at once, you learn to read a room very quickly." She smiled a little, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face entirely, softened it, opened it. "You learn that a restless child in the back corner will unsettle the whole front row within approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes, he repeated. "Approximately," she said firmly, and he did laugh at that, a genuine laugh that surprised them both. That evening they camped on a limestone flat above a creek, and the sky turned extraordinary colors as the sun went down, deep orange bleeding into purple, the clouds catching fire at their edges. Sallie stood at the edge of the flat and watched it with her hands at her sides, and Bernard found himself watching her watch it, which was not something he usually did. He was not a man who spent much time on sunsets or other people's faces. But there was something in the quality of her attention that was catching, the way a clear note of music in an empty room catches in the chest before you have decided to listen. He turned away and built the fire. 3 days north of Laredo they reached the Nueces River, and Bernard chose their crossing point carefully. A wide, shallow ford he knew well, where the water ran clear over smooth rock and the banks on either side were gradual. Sallie rode her bay into the water without hesitation, the horse picking its way deliberately across, and the cold water ran up over her stirrups, and she sat straight through it without a sound, though her face told him clearly enough that it was cold. "You are welcome to complain," Bernard said as they climbed out on the far bank, water streaming from the horse's legs. "I was taught that complaining is unproductive," she said, wringing water from the edge of her skirt with brisk efficiency. "It can be satisfying, though." She considered this with mock seriousness. "Very well, that was extremely cold and my feet are soaking and I believe I have river mud on my traveling hat." "Better," he said. She laughed again, and this time she did not seem surprised by it. They were above the Nueces now, crossing north through country that Bernard knew by heart. He had ridden this stretch more times than he could easily count, and the familiarity of it was like a comfortable coat. He knew where the water was, knew where the ground could be trusted, knew the particular quality of stillness that settled over the cedar breaks in the late afternoon when the wind dropped. He moved through it easily, reading it without effort. But somewhere in those miles, he began to be more aware than usual of the sound of another horse beside him, of a voice that asked questions with genuine interest, and not merely to fill silence, of the way Sallie Barrett carried herself through country that was entirely foreign to her with a quiet dignity that was not pride exactly, but something more honest than pride, something closer to conviction, the settled knowledge that she would manage whatever came next, and that she did not need to perform her confidence in order to have it. On the fourth night, camped in the curve of a dry creek bed with a good fire going, and a sky that was throwing stars around with reckless extravagance, they talked until well past the time he usually slept. She told him about the school she had taught in, and the children she had loved, and the one boy, Mateo, who had been the sharpest student she had ever seen but whose family had needed him for farm work, and who had stopped coming halfway through his second year. She talked about that with a specific grief that was not theatrical but real, the kind that settles quietly in a particular corner of a person and does not leave. He told her about the trail drive he had worked at 22, the first time he had ever seen Kansas, the way the land flattened out north of the Arkansas River into something so vast and unbroken that it felt like standing at the edge of the world. He told her about a river crossing that had gone wrong not to frighten her, but because it was part of the shape of his experience, and it felt dishonest not to include it, and the way the cook, an older man named Prout, had pulled 2 men out of the current with nothing but a rope and sheer stubbornness. He found himself telling her things about that life that he did not usually put into words, because most of the people he guided were not interested in the texture of his experience, only in his competence. Sallie Barrett was interested in the texture of things. "What is Abilene like?" she asked. "It was a rough cattle town for a time," he said honestly. "But it has quieted in the last few years. The rail terminus has moved west, so the drive traffic has shifted. It is settling into something more like a proper town. Stores, churches, a newspaper, people putting down roots." She was quiet for a moment. "That is what I need," she said. "Roots, a place that is mine." She paused. "I do not mean to sound I am not foolish about it. I know it will be hard starting there alone, but I have managed alone before." He looked at her across the fire, the light catching in her dark eyes. "I do not doubt it," he said, and he meant it fully, with no reservation at all. She looked at him for a moment, and something passed between them in that look, some acknowledgement, some mutual recognition, and then she looked away at the fire, and he did too. He woke earlier than usual the next morning, when the sky was still the deep gray blue of pre-dawn, and he lay still in his blanket for a moment, aware of something that felt like restlessness but was not quite that, more like attention, the feeling of something being present that had not been there before. He got up and built the fire up for coffee, and pushed the feeling aside with the efficiency of a man who is good at pushing things aside. The days built on each other as days do on the trail, each one shaped by the land and the weather and the thousand small decisions that make up the work of moving through open country. They crossed the San Antonio River without difficulty and passed through the outskirts of San Antonio itself on the seventh day, and Sallie was quiet as they moved through the edges of the city, looking at the streets and buildings with an expression that was careful and composed but not indifferent. This was the place she had lived her whole life, and she was leaving it in a direction she could not reverse. They did not stop in San Antonio. They had supplies enough, and there was nothing to stop for that would not make the leaving harder. Bernard kept them moving at a steady pace through the northern quarters of the city and out again onto the road that pushed up through the hill country toward Austin, and when the city had finally fallen behind them, Sallie let out a long breath that she seemed to have been holding for quite some time. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I will be," she said. And then, after a moment, "Yes, I am." The hill country was beautiful in a way that was different from the scrubland to the south, green and rolling, the creeks full and clear with spring water, the live oaks massive and ancient on the hillsides. They made good time through it, camping 2 nights among the hills, and the days had a rhythm to them now that felt almost like something they had established together. The way they moved through the morning in comfortable silence, the way they fell into conversation by midday as naturally as if they had always talked, the way the evenings at the fire had become the best part of the day in ways that Bernard was not examining too closely. On the 9th night, a storm came in from the west. They had seen it building all afternoon, a high dark wall of cloud that climbed the sky with purpose, the light ahead of it going that particular peculiar yellow that meant real weather was coming. Bernard had been watching it and choosing their campsite with it in mind, finding a site in a draw where they were sheltered from the worst of the west wind, with a limestone overhang that gave some cover. They got camp set up, and the horses hobbled, and the supplies secured before the first heavy drops fell, and then they were huddled under the overhang, with the fire sputtering as the wind found its angles around the rock. The storm was not violent, no lightning to speak of, no real danger, but the rain came hard and steady, and the world outside their small shelter turned into a gray wall of water and sound. Sallie was sitting with her back against the rock wall, her knees drawn up, her hat drying beside her. She was watching the rain with the calm, focused look she gave to things that interested her. Bernard was close beside her in the limited dry space under the overhang, not improper, not anything other than practical necessity, but closer than they usually sat. He was aware of it with an awareness he had been working to manage for several days now. "I used to love storms when I was a girl," she said. "We had a long covered porch, and my mother and I would sit there and watch the rain come in off the hills. She would tell me stories." She paused. "She died when I was 15. "I am sorry," he said. "She was remarkable," Sallie said simply, with the settled peace of someone who has arrived at the other side of a long grief. She was the kind of woman who made every room she was in feel warmer, not louder, warmer. She glanced at him sideways. "I think I have been trying to be like her my whole life and never quite managing it." "Why would you say that?" Bernard asked. "I am too direct," she said, "too matter of fact. She had a warmth that was easy and immediate. I have to work at warmth. It does not come naturally." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the rain. "That is not how you seem to me," he said. He felt her look at him. "How do I seem to you?" she asked, and her voice was careful, the way voices get when the question matters more than it looks. He thought about it honestly. "Like someone who pays attention," he said. "Like someone who takes things seriously, not because they are performing seriousness, but because they have thought about what matters and decided to give it the weight it deserves." He paused. "That is not distance. That is, I think it is the opposite of distance." The rain fell steadily outside their shelter. The fire threw small moving light across the rock face above them. "That is the most you have said to me at one time," Sallie said softly. "You asked a real question," he said. After a long moment, she said, "Thank you, Bernard," and it was the first time she had used his given name, and he noticed it the way you notice the first time a door opens that has been closed. They reached the Colorado River north of Austin on the 12th day of the journey, and this crossing was different from the nooses. The river was running higher with spring snowmelt from the hills, the current stronger, the ford they had been aiming for less cooperative than Bernard had hoped. He spent a long time on the bank, reading the water, while Sallie stood quietly with the horses and did not press him for a decision. He finally chose a line that angled slightly upstream and used the current rather than fighting it. He crossed first with Cressida, feeling the river test the horse's footing, and made it to the far bank with the water only belly-deep on the mare at the deepest point. He tied Cressida and waded back, partly to guide Sallie across, partly because the mule was going to need convincing. The mule was correct in its assessment that this was an unpleasant undertaking and required significant encouragement. Sallie managed the bay on her own while Bernard hauled the mule by the lead rope, and they all arrived on the north bank wet and breathless, and the mule expressed its feelings about the whole situation at considerable volume. Sallie was laughing, not politely, not carefully, but fully and genuinely, and the sound of it was so unexpected and so bright that Bernard stopped what he was doing for a moment and just listened to it. "He has opinions," she managed, gesturing at the mule, who was still announcing his grievances. "He always has opinions," Bernard said. "He expressed similar views about a puddle 3 days ago." "He is consistent, at least," she said, and then she looked at him, really looked at him, still laughing, a little water dripping from her hat brim, her cheeks flushed with cold and exertion, and something in his chest did something inconvenient and entirely without his permission. He turned back to the mule. It was somewhere around the second crossing that things shifted in a way he would later think about with great clarity, because it was the point at which the $30 advance and the $40 completion fee and the professional efficiency that had guided every decision he had made for the last 12 days quietly stepped back and allowed something else to move forward. Something that had less to do with competence and considerably more to do with the way a woman looked when she was laughing at a mule in the middle of a river. He had not lost his professionalism. He was still watching the terrain, still making the decisions that kept them safe, still thinking ahead to water sources and weather and the safest route through the country north of Austin. But alongside all of that, unbidden and unhurried, something else had taken root. He told himself it was none of his business. He was being paid to get her to Abilene safely, and that was the whole of his obligation. Whatever she was, thoughtful, direct, brave in the quiet, steady way that is more impressive than the loud kind. None of it was his business, and he would do well to remember that. He remembered it for most of the afternoon. By evening, he had mostly stopped trying. They camped north of the Colorado in good grass, and while Bernard was building the fire, Sallie unpacked her canvas bag and produced something he had not seen before, a small book, worn at the corners, the leather cover dark with handling. "What is that?" he asked. "Poetry," she said, with the particular self-possession of someone expecting mild mockery and not particularly caring about it. "Read some," he said. She looked at him, clearly reassessing something. Then she opened the book to a page she seemed to know and read aloud, her voice steady and clear in the evening air. And it was Walt Whitman, one of the Leaves of Grass poems, and the words moved through the campsite like wind through grass, and Bernard sat still and listened to every syllable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "My mother had a book," he said. "Not poetry, the Psalms, just the Psalms, in a small Bible she kept in her apron pocket. She would read them aloud sometimes in the evening. I always thought it was the sound of her voice as much as anything. The way some voices make words feel like they have weight." Sallie looked at him, and the look was soft and full of something he could not name precisely, but recognized the way you recognize a landmark from a distance. "Your voice does that," she said quietly. You probably do not know it. He looked at the fire. I did not know it, he said. Austin to the north and then the long country pushing toward Waco. They moved through it steadily, the land opening up into broader plains north of the hill country, the sky growing more enormous with each day's travel, the way it does in Texas when the land flattens and there is nothing left to interrupt the horizon. Sallie watched it all with the same attentive intensity she brought to everything, asking questions about what she saw, about the land and the history of it, about the people who had come before them both. She asked about the Comanche, with a seriousness and respect that surprised him, not because it should have, but because most people in 1873 did not approach the question with that quality of genuine interest. She had read about the treaties, she said, and about the way those treaties had been made and broken, and she found it difficult to hold the contradiction between the beauty of the land and the nature of how it had been taken. Bernard told her what he knew from his own experience and observation, not editorializing but not soft-pedaling either, and she listened without interrupting, her brow slightly furrowed, working through it honestly. It is important to know the whole shape of things, she said, even when the shape is ugly. Especially then, he said. She nodded. My father did not think that way. He preferred his version of history. I spent a great deal of my youth arguing with him about it. And what did he say to that? He said I would learn better when I was older. She paused. I am older now. I have not learned better. He smiled at that, and she smiled back, and they rode on through the wide green country with the blue hills at their backs and the flat sky ahead. They were passing through a small settlement 3 days north of Austin, a cluster of buildings around a crossroads, a trading post, a church, a smithy, when a rider came in from the western road at a clip and pulled up short beside them, his horse breathing hard. He was a young man, maybe 20, with dust on his face and an expression of someone delivering bad news. He was not looking for them specifically. Bernard could see that. But he slowed when he saw them because people in small places stop for strangers on the road. There is a gang been working the road north of here, the young man said without preamble, robbing travelers between here and Waco. Word is they stopped a freight wagon yesterday morning. Bernard nodded. How many? 3 men from what we heard, riding together, one on a gray horse. They take what they want and move on, have not hurt anyone yet, but he shrugged in the way that suggests that yet is doing a lot of work. Bernard thanked him, and they stopped at the trading post to water the horses and think. Sallie stood beside him at the trough, her expression calm and practical. What do? We go around, he said. I know a road that cuts east before it comes north again. It adds half a day, maybe a little more, but it keeps us off the main road. Then we go around, she said simply. He looked at her. You are not concerned. I am practical, she said. Being concerned and being practical are not the same thing. You know the alternate route. We will take the alternate route. I trust your judgment. Nobody had said that to him in quite that way before, without caveat, without the particular edge of someone who trusts your judgment because they have no better option. She said it the way people say things they actually believe. They took the eastern road and added the half day without complaint, and arrived north of the reported trouble without incident, joining back onto the main road, where the country smoothed out again into long, gentle rolls of tall grass, and the whole episode became a footnote rather than a chapter. But in the evenings after that, when they made camp and the firelight was doing its nightly business of making the world smaller and more intimate, Bernard found himself looking up from what he was doing and finding her already there. Not looking at him, usually, but simply present in his field of vision, in a way that felt important in a manner he was tired of pretending not to notice. On the 15th night, camped on a flat stretch above the Brazos River with Waco half a day's ride behind them, he said something he had not planned to say. They had been talking about nothing important, about the difference between Kansas and Texas grass, about whether the mule had a worse personality than average or whether mules were generally like this. And there was a small pause in the conversation, and in that pause he said, without preamble or strategy, I think about the journey being over. She looked at him, I think about it and I do not find myself looking forward to it, he said, keeping his eyes on the fire. That has not happened to me before. Usually I am counting miles. The silence that followed was careful and full. I think about it too, she said quietly, and I find the same thing. He looked at her then, and she was looking at him, and the fire was small and steady between them, and the night was enormous around them both. Sallie, he said. Bernard, she said, and there was something in the way she said his name, the small weight she put on it, the way she let it sit in the air, that was neither an answer nor a question, but something in between that was more honest than either. He did not say anything else, neither did she. But when she said good night and lay down on her bedroll, he sat by the fire for a long time afterward, thinking about rivers and roads and the particular arithmetic of how far they had come and how much further remained and what waited at the end of it. He was being paid to get her to Abilene. That was the fact of the matter, plain and clean. The $30 up front and the $40 upon arrival. A professional transaction between a woman with a destination and a man who knew the road. He had not been hired to fall in love with her, and she had not hired him for that purpose, and there was a specific kind of wrongness he felt when he thought about the asymmetry of their situation. She was dependent on him to get where she needed to go, and that dependence was not a foundation he wanted to build anything on. He thought about that for a long time, until the fire was low and the stars had turned and Cressida shifted in the dark and blew out a long, patient breath. The next morning over coffee he said, I want to be honest with you about something. She looked at him steadily over the tin cup. All right. I am aware that I am being paid to escort you, and that there is an imbalance in our situation because of that. You are dependent on this journey in a way that I am not. I do not want to take advantage of that, not even in the small ways. If I have said or done anything that has been Bernard, she said. He stopped. I'm a 24-year-old woman who taught school for 3 years and managed her father's household through his illness, and has now ridden more than 400 miles on an unfamiliar horse through country she has never seen, she said, with a patience that was not condescending, but was very clear. I am not unaware of the circumstances of our situation. I am not confused about the nature of the arrangement or the power in it. She paused. I would ask that you give me credit for knowing my own mind. He was quiet. I know what I feel, she said more softly. I am not in the habit of feeling things without noticing them. He looked at her for a long moment, the morning light on her face, the steady brown eyes. Nor am I, he said. Not any more. She held his gaze. Good, she said for the third time, but this time the word had an entirely different weight, not closing a conversation, but opening something carefully like a door in a good house. North of Waco, the land changed again. The rolling country gave way to broader plains, the cedar and live oak thinning, and then giving way entirely to the big blue stem grass that rolled in long waves in the wind. The sky became a presence in a way it had not been to the south, enormous and changeable, moving through moods with the speed of a river, brilliant blue in the morning, white and towering by noon, sometimes dark and dramatic by evening with clouds that built themselves into cathedrals. They were in cattle country now, proper cattle country, and they encountered the roads and the sign of it regularly well-worn trails, the distant movement of herds on the horizon, once a whole outfit pushing north on the trail beside them for half a day. The cowboys regarding them with the incurious appraisal of men who have too much to do to be curious about strangers. One of the drovers, an older man with a clay pipe clamped in his teeth, rode alongside them briefly and exchanged a few words with Bernard about conditions ahead, about water sources and river levels, and moved on without ceremony. Sallie watched the cattle operation with sharp interest, asking Bernard questions about it afterward, about how the drives worked, about how long they had been running, about the economics of it, about what happened to the cowboys at the end of a drive. They spend their wages, Bernard said, usually in about 3 days, then they come back south and do it again. Is that what you did, for a time? But not anymore. I prefer to know where I am going and why, he said. A cattle drive, you are going north because somebody else decided north. I prefer my own decisions. She was quiet for a moment. I understand that, she said. Then with the smallest of smiles, although at the moment I am going north because someone else decided north. That is different, he said. You decided north a long time ago. I am just the road. She looked at him sideways. You are considerably more interesting than a road. He felt warmth move through him that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. They crossed the Bosque River on a dry and sunny morning, and Bernard chose the crossing well, a graveled ford that the mule could manage without complaint, which was itself a minor victory. They were above the hill country now and fully into the open plains, and the walking was easier even if the wind was stronger, coming in long, unobstructed rushes across the grassland. In the evenings, the ritual of camp had become something they shared without assigned roles, Bernard handling the fire and the cooking, Sallie handling the organization of the camp and the care of their food stores, each of them moving around the other with the practiced ease of people who have been traveling together long enough to know each other's rhythms. She knew how he liked his coffee, which was strong and without embellishment. He knew that she needed to sit quietly for the first 30 minutes after a hard day's ride before she wanted conversation. He knew the exact quality of attention she gave to something that interested her, the way she leaned forward almost imperceptibly, her hands stilling on whatever she was holding, her eyes sharpening. He knew that she talked about her mother with a kind of love that was entirely unsentimental and entirely deep. He knew that she was afraid of heights in a way she managed without complaint, and that she had navigated the limestone bluffs above the Colorado with the deliberate care of someone who is afraid and is going anyway. He knew that she was brave. Not loud about it, not dramatic about it. Just quietly, steadily, reliably brave. And somewhere in those miles of open grass with the wind in their faces and the sky moving overhead, he let himself know, completely and without qualification, that what he felt for Sallie Barrett was not gratitude or professional affection or the natural intimacy of shared hardship. It was love, in the plain and total sense of the word, the kind that does not ask permission and does not offer a schedule and does not wait for convenient timing. He had stopped counting the payment days ago. It was somewhere around the Red River country that he told her, though not in the way he had planned to tell her, because he had not planned to tell her at all. They had stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat, finding a good spot near a small creek where the cottonwood trees were just beginning to come out in their spring green, the leaves tiny and bright as new coins. Sallie had taken her shoes off, her feet were sore, she admitted, with the air of someone making a significant concession, and was sitting with her feet in the edge of the cool water, her hat beside her, her hair slightly loosened from its pins by the day's wind. She looked entirely at ease in a way she had not looked on the first day out of Laredo, when her composure had been the careful kind, held in place by intention. This ease was different, unguarded, the ease of someone who has stopped performing and arrived instead at simply being. Bernard was sitting a few feet away, leaning against a cottonwood trunk, watching a red-tailed hawk work the air currents above the creek. And then, because he was watching the hawk and not watching his own mouth, he said, "I am going to miss this." She looked over at him. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely at the creek, the cottonwoods, the sky, and not really meaning any of those things. "Traveling with you." She was quiet, looking at him with her measuring, honest eyes. "I am going to miss it too," she said, "but I think," she stopped and then started again more carefully, "I think things do not have to end simply because a journey does." He met her eyes. "No," he agreed, his voice low and even, "they do not have to end." They looked at each other across the few feet of grass and dappled shadow, and the creek ran its small, bright conversation beside them, and the hawk cried once, high and clean, and he said, "Sallie, I need you to know something that has nothing to do with the work I was hired to do." "Tell me," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. He said it as plainly as he said everything else, without embellishment, without hedging, because he did not know how to say important things any other way. I did not intend for that to happen, and I am entirely aware of the awkward nature of the timing, and I am not asking you for anything on account of it. I think you deserve to know. The creek ran. The cottonwood leaves turned in the light breeze. Sallie looked at him for a long, careful moment. Then she said, "Bernard Chandler, I have been in love with you since the Brazos River, and I have been making every effort not to behave foolishly about it." He stared at her. "You are doing it again," she said, the corner of her mouth lifting, looking like a man who expected a different answer. "I consistently expect the wrong answers from you," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. She stood up from the creek bank and crossed to where he was sitting and sat down beside him, close beside him, and looked at the hawk that was still working its slow circles overhead. "I am going to Abilene," she said. "I have to. That land is my future and I intend to claim it." "I know," he said. "But I would very much like you to still be there when I get there," she said, and her voice was steady and direct and entirely without performance. "If that is something you are interested in." He reached over and took her hand, which was resting in the grass between them, and she did not pull it away. Her hand was warm and a little rough from the days of riding, and it fit in his with the specific comfort of something that is exactly right. "I am interested in that," he said. "Very much interested in that." She did not say good, and he did not feel any need to fill the silence. And they sat together in the cottonwood shade with their hands joined and watched the hawk ride the air above the creek, and the afternoon moved around them in its slow, golden way. They reached the Red River crossing on the 22nd day, which marked the crossing from Texas into Indian Territory, the long stretch of land that would eventually become Oklahoma. The Red River here ran wide and reddish-brown, carrying the color of its bed, and the crossing was a significant one, not technically dangerous at this late spring level, but meaningful. Bernard had been watching the water level for the past 2 days, and it was manageable. He went through his usual routine at the bank, reading the current, picking his line, checking the horses. The mule regarded the river with deep philosophical suspicion. Sallie watched Bernard work through the assessment with the same quiet attention she always brought to his decisions, not second-guessing, not hurrying him. When he had his line, she said, "Lead the way," and when they were halfway across, with the brown water running cold and strong against the horse's legs and the far bank looking closer and more solid with each step, she called out over the sound of the current, "I find I am no longer afraid of river crossings." "I find the same," he called back, and they both knew he was not talking about rivers. They pulled out on the Indian Territory side, the horses blowing, the mule protesting, and Sallie took off her hat and let the afternoon sun hit her face with her eyes closed for a long moment, and Bernard stood beside her and watched the Red River run south behind them, and felt the extraordinary specific weight of a man who has nothing to regret. Indian Territory was different country from Texas, greener, more wooded in places, with the cross timbers belt of dense blackjack oak and post oak that ran like a wall through the landscape. They navigated it carefully, staying to the well-established trail rather than trying shortcuts through the timber, and made steady progress north and then northeast toward the Kansas line. They encountered a Chickasaw family on the road 3 days into Indian Territory, a man and his wife and 2 children traveling south in a wagon loaded with household goods, and stopped to exchange what news they had, the usual currency of the road, information about conditions ahead, water sources, the state of the trails. The man spoke good English and knew the country well, and gave Bernard useful information about the creek crossings further north. They parted with the mutual courtesy of travelers who have each benefited from the exchange. Sallie was quiet for a time after that, and Bernard knew her well enough by now to know she was thinking something through. "The territory," she said finally. "These are the people who were moved here, who were told this was their land and then watched it be negotiated and renegotiated around them." "Yes," Bernard said, "and now we are moving through it." She paused. "I do not know how to reconcile that." I do not think I should reconcile it too easily. No, he said. I think the right response to things that cannot be easily reconciled is to carry them honestly and not forget them. She looked at him. That is wise, she said. My father said something like it once, he said. About the land we lost, he said, do not forgive so quickly that you forget what was done. The forgiveness is not for them, it is for you. But the memory has to stay because the memory is the thing that makes you work against it happening to someone else. Sallie was quiet for a long time after that, and when she finally spoke, she said, Your father sounds like he was a good man. He was, Bernard said. He was. They cleared the cross timbers and came out into the open country of southern Kansas on the 27th day. And the land was spectacular in the way that the Kansas plains are spectacular in late spring. The grass thick and green, the wildflowers running in streams of color across the rolling ground, the sky doing its enormous cloudscapes overhead. The air was different here, cooler, cleaner, with a smell of rain and grass. Sallie pulled her horse to a stop on a rise and looked out over it, and Bernard stopped beside her. This is it, she said, almost to herself. This is what he was holding onto. He did not need to ask who she meant. It is good land, Bernard said. It is beautiful land, she said, her voice soft. I understand him a little better standing here. He was holding on to something worth holding. She turned to look at Bernard with clear, shining eyes. I am glad I came. I am glad you came too, Bernard said, and the particular emphasis he put on it, the small shift in the pronoun, made her smile in a way that reached all the way to those brown eyes and stayed there. They were 3 days' ride from Abilene. He found himself not wanting to hurry. But the land between them and the town was easy going, good roads and good weather, and they made the miles naturally, camping 2 more nights under the Kansas sky. On the last night before they were due to arrive, they made camp near a small creek that ran clear and cold over smooth rock, and the sunset was something that belonged in a painting. The whole western sky going from gold to deep rose to a purple that faded at the edges into blue. Sallie had made the coffee that evening. She had watched him make it for 4 weeks and 1 day, and had concluded she could improve on the process, which she had, in fact, managed to do, and the superior quality of the resulting coffee was a topic that was causing Bernard some professional embarrassment. He received his cup with dignity, and she received his admission that it was better with a satisfaction that was entirely unsubtle. When we arrive tomorrow, he said over the fire, and you have the property and everything is settled, what is your plan? She looked thoughtful. The house will need work. I know that. My father's letters described it as livable but in want of attention. I intend to take stock of it honestly and then make a list and address the list item by item. She paused. The land, I cannot work it alone, not properly, but I can perhaps rent portions of it initially and build from there. That is sensible, he said. I am a sensible person, she agreed. You are also a person, he said, who reads Whitman aloud in the middle of nowhere and argues with her father about history and cried quietly at the edge of San Antonio because she was leaving the only city she had ever known and would not admit it was hard. She looked at him, her expression startled and then soft. I thought I was being discreet. You were, he said. I just pay attention. She looked at the fire for a moment. I was thinking about that boy, Mateo. The one who had to stop coming to school. I was thinking about all the things I did not get to teach him, all the things I will not teach anyone for a while if I am working a property alone. She paused. I did not think I would miss it so acutely, but I do. Bernard set down his cup. He had been thinking about something for 3 days, and he thought about it now with care, wanting to say it correctly. Sallie, he said, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me with the same directness you have given me since the day we left Laredo. She gave him her full attention, the way she always did when something mattered. I would like to stay in Abilene, he said. Not to escort you or guide you or do any work for any pay, simply to be there, near you. And if you would allow it, to do the work of becoming the kind of man who might, in time and with your full agreement, be worthy of asking you a considerably more permanent question. She was very still. "I have never stayed anywhere," he said. "I have always moved on because there was never a reason to stay. But there is a reason now, and she is sitting across this fire from me, and I am asking." Sallie Barrett looked at him for a long, luminous moment, and when she spoke, her voice was steady but her eyes were bright. "Bernard Chandler," she said, "if you do not stay in Abilene, I will be very put out with you." He laughed, a full, free laugh that surprised him with its ease, and she laughed too, and the sound of it went out into the Kansas night and scattered among the stars. They reached Abilene on the 30th day of the journey, rolling into town in the mid-morning light, the streets busy with the ordinary commerce of a frontier town settling into itself. It was smaller than the rowdy cattle terminus town it had briefly been. The big drives had shifted their routes west, to Ellsworth and then Dodge City, and Abilene was becoming something quieter and more permanent, the saloons giving way to hardware stores and feed merchants, and a school that sat at the end of the main street with freshly painted white siding. Sallie saw the school and looked at it for a long moment as they rode past. Thomas Whitfield had arranged for a local attorney named Greer to handle the final transfer of the property deed, and they went to his office first, where the paperwork was produced and reviewed and signed with the deliberate care of legal transactions. And when it was done, Sallie was in possession of a deed to a house and 12 acres of farmland on the eastern edge of town, and the attorney shook her hand and congratulated her on her arrival. She stepped out of the attorney's office into the Abilene street and held the deed and looked at it with both hands, and Bernard stood beside her and watched her face. "It is real," she said, somewhat wonderingly. "It is real," he confirmed. She folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and looked at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "Let us go see this house." The house was a fair frame structure set back from a dirt road with a covered porch running across the front, 3 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a root cellar that the new grass was trying to reclaim. It needed a new porch step and some attention to the window shutters and a thorough cleaning, and perhaps eventually a fresh coat of whitewash. But it was solid, and the roof was sound, and there was a well in the yard that still drew clear water. Sallie walked through it slowly, room by room, touching the walls and the door frames and the single window that looked out over the property to the east. The land stretched out from the back of the house in rolling grass, good farmland, the kind that would grow corn or winter wheat if it was worked. She came out the back door and stood on the small step and looked at the land, and Bernard stood behind her, and after a moment she reached back and took his hand without turning around, her fingers finding his with the certainty of something familiar. He held her hand and they stood there in the Kansas morning and looked at the land together. He sold the hired horse and mule back to the local livery and arranged for his own mare Cressida to be stabled there while he found work, which did not take long. The town needed men who knew horses and could be trusted to handle them, and the liveryman was glad of the help and offered him fair wages and the use of the small room above the stable. It was not a grand situation, but it was honest, and it put him near enough to be useful and far enough to be decent. He spent the first week helping Sallie put the house in proper order, fixing the porch step, rehinging the shutters, clearing the overgrowth from the root cellar, splitting wood for the season. She worked alongside him in a practical dress with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back, and neighbors began to stop and introduce themselves with the curious friendliness of small towns, and Sallie received each of them with the direct, warm attention she gave to everything, and within 2 weeks she was on first-name terms with half the street. He collected the $40 completion fee that Thomas Whitfield had wired to the local bank when Whitfield received confirmation of their safe arrival. He held the money in his hand for a moment and thought about counting it, and then put it in his coat pocket without counting, because he had stopped thinking about it as the reason for the journey a good 3 weeks ago. He took Sallie to supper at the town's small restaurant on the evening of their first full week in Abilene, and they sat at a table in the lamplight and ate properly cooked food, and it felt both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. the way things do when you have been in the open country for a long time, and the comforts of civilization reassert themselves. She wore a dress he had not seen before, a deep blue-green that she had apparently pressed and saved for this occasion, and her hair was down from the trail pins, pinned differently, more softly, and she looked entirely unlike the practical and composed woman who had stood on the Laredo porch a month ago with her hands folded and her chin up. She looked like herself fully, in a way that people sometimes look when they have arrived somewhere they belong. "You are staring," she said, with the small upward curve of her mouth. "I am looking," he corrected. "There is a difference." "And what is the difference?" "Staring is careless," he said. "What I am doing is deliberate." She looked at him across the table with her direct, steady gaze and the warm brown of her eyes in the lamplight, and she said, "Bernard, I am very glad you stayed." "There was never any question of my leaving," he said. He had been asking himself. In the honest way he tried to ask himself important questions, whether what he felt was the compressed emotion of a long journey or something with more permanence to it. He had looked at it from every angle he could find, and from every angle it looked the same, certain, settled, completely without doubt. He had been to the other side of wanting and back, and this was different in a way he could not quite quantify, except to say that it felt like standing on solid ground after a long time on moving water. He asked her to marry him 3 months after they arrived in Abilene. He did it on a Sunday afternoon in October, when the Kansas sky was doing something extravagant with the autumn clouds, and the grass on her property had gone gold, and the air had that particular bite that meant winter was thinking about arriving. They were walking along the back boundary of her land, which had become something they did on Sundays, a thing they had established together by the simple repetition of doing it, and he stopped walking, and she stopped too, and turned to look at him with that expression of alert attention. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone that he had carried in his coat pocket since the day he had packed up the last of his family's belongings from their taken property. He had not known when he packed it why he was bringing it. He thought he knew now. "Sallie," he said, "I have been in love with you since a river crossing in Texas, and I have spent 3 months being certain that what I feel is real and permanent and entirely suited to the word I am about to use." He held out the ring. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and then at him, and her eyes were bright and her expression was that combination of steady and soft that was uniquely hers. "Bernard Chandler," she said, "I have been waiting for you to ask me that since approximately the Colorado River." "That was 12 days into the journey," he said with feeling. "I know," she said, with the patient reasonableness of a former schoolteacher. "I have been very patient." He laughed and slipped the ring onto her finger, and she looked at it for a moment with the same concentrated attention she gave to things she wanted to keep carefully. And then she stepped toward him and he gathered her in, and she pressed her face against his chest, and he held her there in the October afternoon, with the Kansas wind moving the gold grass around them, and the sky doing its enormous quiet work overhead. They were married in December, at the small Methodist church at the end of Abilene's Main Street, in a ceremony attended by the neighbors who had become friends over the preceding months, by the liveryman who had become something of a surrogate uncle to Bernard, and by the local schoolteacher, Mrs. Harmon, who had made Sallie's acquaintance within a week of arrival and was now a close friend. Sallie wore the blue-green dress from the restaurant evening, which had been let out slightly and carefully fitted, and Bernard wore a suit coat he had bought from the dry goods store and which fit him almost correctly. Sallie had laughed at the almost and fixed the collar herself with a small pair of scissors and declared it adequate. She carried a small bunch of late fall flowers from the garden that Mrs. Harmon had pressed into her hands that morning, and when she walked down the aisle of the small church toward where he was standing, Bernard thought, with absolute clarity and zero reservation, that this was the best moment of his entire life. They wintered in the house on her land, and it was a good winter, cold and snowy in the way that Kansas winters were, but the house was solid and the fireplace drew well, and they were warm. Bernard took on extra work at the livery and saved carefully, and they made plans for the spring planting. He had experience with winter wheat from his ranching days and knew how to manage it, and Sallie proved to have a natural instinct for the agricultural decisions that came from years of practical attention to how things worked. She wrote to the school board in January, not to apply for the teaching position that was already filled by Mrs. Harmon, but to offer her services as an additional instructor for the older children, who had outgrown what the existing classroom could properly accommodate. The school board accepted after a meeting that apparently involved some deliberation and some doubt about whether a newly married woman would have the staying power, which Sallie addressed in her follow-up letter with such pointed and well-organized argument that the school board apparently felt it best to simply agree. Bernard found this intensely satisfying. Spring came to Kansas in that gradual and then sudden way it does weeks of cold and gray, and then a morning where the light is different, sharper and more golden, and the ground begins to soften, and the first green appears in the old grass. Bernard planted the wheat in the east field in March, working the land with a rented team and the patient attention of a man who takes satisfaction in doing things properly. Sallie planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house with a thoroughness that suggested it was going to be the best kitchen garden in Abilene's history. On a warm evening in April, sitting on the porch they had repaired together the previous autumn, with the sound of the spring frogs from the creek behind the property, Sallie put down the letter she had been reading and looked at him sideways in the way she had when she was preparing to say something. "Bernard," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are going to have a child." He was very still for a moment. The frogs sang in the darkness below the porch. The spring stars had come out above the tree line to the east, thick and generous, the same stars that had hung over every campsite between Laredo and this porch, all those hundreds of miles of open sky. He turned to look at her. She was watching him with her direct and open eyes, and there was something in her expression, not quite anxiety, but close to it, the edge of uncertainty about what he would say, and that edge of uncertainty in her, which was so rarely uncertain, moved him so completely that he could not speak for a moment. He took her hand. He started and stopped, because adequate language felt impossible to locate. "I am so Sallie, I am so glad." The uncertainty went out of her face and something else came in relief and happiness and something deeper and quieter, the particular joy that belongs to the knowledge that what you feared might not be shared is, in fact, shared completely. "I am glad too," she said, her voice soft. He pulled her close, and she came without resistance, fitting under his arm with the ease of something that has been doing this long enough to be natural, and they sat on the porch in the spring evening and listened to the frogs and the wind in the new grass and the quiet, enormous aliveness of the Kansas night. Their son was born in November, 2 days before the first hard frost, at the house on the property with Mrs. Harmon's wife in attendance as midwife, a practical and capable woman who had brought half the children in Abilene into the world and who managed the whole event with brisk confidence. Bernard was in the house, not sent away, because Sallie had said with considerable firmness that she wanted him there, and he had been there, and it had been the most frightening and most extraordinary night of his entire life. The boy was healthy and loud, with his mother's dark hair and his father's eyes, that creekwater color that shifted between green and gray. They named him Harold James Chandler, Harold for Sallie's father, James for Bernard's, the two men who had each in their own imperfect way shaped the people their children had become. Bernard held his son for the first time in the small hours of the morning, while Sallie slept the deep sleep of a woman who had just accomplished something enormous and was entitled to rest. He sat by the fireplace with the baby in the crook of his arm and looked at the small sleeping face and felt something that was beyond any name he could find for it, a love so total and undifferentiated that it had no edges, that simply extended in all directions indefinitely, like the Kansas sky. He thought about a morning in Laredo, 43 cents in his coat pocket, a horse with a loose shoe. He thought about a porch and a woman with her chin up and her hands folded. He thought about rivers and cottonwood shade, and a mule with opinions and a hawk crying once, high and clean, over a creek in Indian Territory. He thought about $30 up front and $40 upon safe arrival, and he laughed quietly in the fire-lit room so as not to wake anyone. He had stopped counting somewhere around the second river. He was very grateful that he had. The years in Abilene built on each other the way good years do, unhurried and solid, each one laying down something the next could build on. The wheat crop did well the first year and better the second, and by the third year they had hired help for the planting, and Bernard had taken on a partnership at the livery, which had expanded to a proper horse trading business that suited his skills and his knowledge of good horses exactly. Sallie taught the older children at the school every weekday morning and came home at midday and ran the household and the property with the same methodical effectiveness she brought to everything, and was regarded by the town with a respect that was genuine and warm. Little Harold Harry, as he quickly became, was a bright and energetic child who had his mother's quality of direct attention and his father's habit of going quiet when something interested him, and he followed Bernard around the property on his short legs with a devotion that Bernard found both touching and mildly alarming in terms of the places it led. He was 2 years old when he attempted to follow Bernard into the horse pen, and 3 years old when he succeeded, and the roan mare Cressida, old now and semi-retired, regarded him with the patient tolerance she had always shown for things that were not her problem. When Harry was 3.5, Sallie told Bernard that there was going to be another child. "You are pleased," she said, watching his face. "I am very pleased," he said. "Good," she said, and the word had its old familiar finality, though it was warmer now than it had ever been, warmed by years and shared mornings and the particular intimacy of a life that two people have been building together long enough to know its shape. The second child was a girl, born in the spring, with Bernard's lighter coloring and Sallie's direct gaze, and they named her Clara Ruth Chandler. She was a calm baby who observed the world with great seriousness from the beginning, and within 6 months it was apparent that she was going to be every bit as thoughtful and direct as her mother, which was both a joy and, Bernard suspected, a future challenge for everyone in her vicinity. He told Sallie this, and she looked at him with complete innocence and said, "I cannot imagine what you mean." He shook his head with the helpless affection of a man who has made his peace with being outmatched. On an evening in the summer when Clara was 8 months old and Harry was not quite 5, and the wheat was high in the east field, and the kitchen garden was extravagantly productive, and the livery business was sound, and the house had been properly whitewashed, and the porch step had been replaced twice, Bernard sat on the porch with Sallie beside him and Clara in her lap and Harry asleep inside, and the Kansas evening was doing its long, slow, golden thing with the light, the way it did in summer, stretching everything out until the world felt both ancient and very immediate. "I have been thinking," Sallie said. "About what?" "About Mateo," she said, "the boy I told you about. I heard from a former colleague in San Antonio last month. He has been corresponding with some of the families. Mateo is 18 now." Bernard looked at her. And he is working on a farm because it is all that has been available to him," she said. "He is 18 and he is bright and he has done nothing but work since he was 12, and she paused. "I wrote to my colleague, asked if Mateo would be willing to come north. We have the property and we need help with the farm, and I think," she looked at him with her direct and honest eyes, "I think a young man like that deserves the chance that a good place and decent wages could give him. I think the school here could offer him something, and I think we could offer him something too." Bernard was quiet for a moment, looking at the wheat field in the evening light. "You are going to change that boy's life," he said. "I am going to offer him an opportunity," she corrected. "What he does with it is his." "Write the letter," Bernard said. She smiled, and it was the full, open smile that had been doing inconvenient things to his composure since the Nueces River, and she said, "I already sent it." He laughed, and Clara startled and looked at him with wide, solemn eyes, and he made a face at her that made her smile enormously, showing her two new front teeth. And Harry's voice came from inside asking about something with the urgent incoherence of a child who is mostly asleep. And Sallie called back to him and settled Clara on her hip, and the evening wrapped around all of them like something that had always been there. Mateo arrived in Abilene 6 weeks later on the afternoon stage, 18 years old and quiet in the watchful way of someone who is accustomed to being underestimated, carrying a single bag and looking at Sallie Barrett Chandler, who was standing at the stage stop with her husband and her 2 children with the expression of someone working out whether to trust something. Sallie shook his hand and said, "I always knew you were going to do something with all that intelligence. I am glad I get to see part of it." He was taller than she remembered and considerably more composed, and something in his face shifted at her words, not dissolving but settling, the way things settle when they have been waiting for a particular note to be struck. Bernard shook his hand too and said, "You can start with the east field. I will show you what we are doing with the wheat." Mateo looked between them and said, in his quiet, deliberate way, "All right." Within a month he was enrolled in the evening classes that a newly established school board was beginning to offer for older students. Within a year, he was the best student in those classes. Within 3 years, he was helping teach them. But that is a story that belongs to him, and to another time. On a Sunday afternoon in October, the same month, the same angle of light, the same gold grass, Bernard and Sallie walked the back boundary of their land as they had walked it every Sunday for 4 years. Harry ran ahead of them, at the age where running is the preferred mode of travel for all occasions, and Clara rode on Bernard's shoulders with her small hands gripping his hair with considerable confidence. They reached the far corner of the property, where the boundary stone sat in the grass beside a wild plum thicket, and stopped there as they always did, looking out over the land. The sky was doing its October thing, great towers of white cloud, the blue between them the specific blue that belonged to this season and this latitude, a blue that Bernard had come to think of as his. "I was thinking," Sallie said. "About what?" "About a man who had 43 cents in his coat pocket and rode into Laredo without any intention of falling in love," she said, and looked at him sideways with the small upward curve at the corner of her mouth. He looked at her. "How do you know about the 43 cents? "You told me," she said. "On the 14th day, you do not remember." He thought about it. He did remember, vaguely, a night with a good fire and a long conversation about money and what it was worth and what it was not worth. "I suppose I did. I kept that," she said. "I kept all of it. The mule, the cottonwood trees, the hawk." He looked at her, this woman who had stood on a porch in Laredo with her chin up and her whole future ahead of her, and the courage to walk toward it, who had put her feet in a cold river, and ridden through brush country and read Walt Whitman aloud in the firelight and argued about history, and buried her father's difficult love alongside the other kind and arrived at this piece of Kansas ground, and made it something real and living and generously, wholly hers. "I kept all of it too," he said. Clara patted the top of his head with small, confident hands, and Harry came running back from somewhere up ahead with something in his fist that was probably going to require an explanation. And the afternoon sat around them in its gold October way, warm and permanent, and the grass moved in the light wind, and the sky was everywhere. There was a road behind them 700 miles long, running south through Indian Territory and Texas all the way to a small town on the Rio Grande, where a man had been hired to do a job. He had done the job. He had done considerably more than the job, and the considerably more had turned out to be the whole of the story, the part that contained everything worth having, the part that had made a home out of open country and a life out of what had begun as a transaction, and 2 strangers on a road heading north. He had been hired to get her to Abilene. He had stopped counting the payments somewhere around the second river. And standing now on his own land in his own October, with his wife's hand in his and his daughter's hands in his hair, and his son's voice coming toward him across the gold Kansas grass, Bernard Chandler was entirely certain that stopping had been the best decision he had ever made. The plum thicket behind the boundary stone was heavy with late fruit, and a meadowlark sang from somewhere in the grass, one clear repeated note that went out over the land and did not ask to be answered, only heard. Sallie leaned against his shoulder, and he held her hand, and the afternoon moved around them in its slow gold way, and everything was well.